If you're using the same cinematic settings that everyone recommends, you are unintentionally ruining your footage. And the worst part is that in the moment it seems right, until you see the results later in the edit. This is a problem that I've noticed across thousands of clips, and it affects people with beginner knowledge to people with expensive drones, but the result is still the same: bad footage. Cinematic footage is not about just ticking boxes and blindly using some cinematic settings. It is all about light, movement, perspective, and intention. I've flown drones for years. I've reviewed almost every major camera drone, and I've shot in every environment you can imagine. And after all of this experience, the biggest mistake I see people do is just blindly copying those cinematic settings that people find online. Just because someone tells you to shoot in 24 frames per second, use the 180-degree shutter rule, use ND filters, and shoot in flat color profile, it doesn't mean your footage will get cinematic by itself. Actually, most of the time it won't. Following these rules blindly will leave you with some footage that just looks soft, bland, mushy, and just amateur. Starting out with one of the biggest mistakes, in my opinion, which is the frame rate. For many years, I've been shooting in 24 frames per second, 25 frames per second, which is the PAL European standard, and also 30 frames per second. My conclusion is that for camera footage, indeed, 24 frames per second is the most cinematic one. But when it comes to drone footage, that's not the case. You end up with some footage that is just stuttery and choppy, and especially if you are shooting for YouTube or for any other social media, then it will be played back in a choppy way, resulting in not so smooth playback, which is super annoying. Now, of course, if you're shooting for clients and if you have specific requirements, then of course, by all means, go ahead and shoot in 24 frames per second if that's what your project requires. But if you're shooting mostly for YouTube and for TikTok, Instagram, and any other social media platform, 30 frames per second is the gold standard because of the smooth playback, especially for drone shots. And that goes even further if you're shooting FPV, for example. So this is mistake number one, just blindly shooting in 24 frames per second because it's cinematic. Make your tests, see what works, see what won't work, and pick accordingly. My personal favorite, 30 frames per second. Now, the other main mistake I've seen people do is just blindly using 180-degree shutter rule everywhere for every single scenario when it comes to shooting with their drones. But here is the problem. Drones are constantly moving through space, and motion blur behaves differently in the air as opposed to a ground-based camera. So locking your shutter to exactly the 180-degree shutter rule might not always be optimal for drone footage. Especially when you're shooting from a very high altitude, there's no real reason to use the 180-degree shutter rule because there's no motion blur. Because you're so far away from the ground, there's literally no perceivable motion that you can use the motion blur on. If you're very close to the ground, of course, that makes a huge difference. But just make sure you understand the reason why that motion blur is important. The next mistake is flat color profile misuse. Flat color profiles like D-Log and D-Log-M are not magic. They give you much more control over your footage, yes, but they don't magically make your footage cinematic. If your exposure, white balance, highlights, or shadows are off, your footage will look bad regardless of the color profile. That's exactly why I standardized, if that's even a word, my workflow with SuperGrade. It doesn't fix bad lighting or bad judgment when you are shooting with your drone, but gives you a very nice baseline so you can completely eliminate that starting process of getting your shots looking nice. Now, I want to clarify something because it comes up a lot. No LUT, including mine, will make your footage cinematic just by itself. Light, timing, and movement still matter more than anything. With that being said, if you're shooting in D-Log or D-Log-M, starting from a clean and intentional look makes a huge difference. And that's why I built SuperGrade. It corrects the technical stuff and pushes the footage toward a more cinematic direction, which I really like. So I'm not starting from scratch on every single edit. The details on SuperGrade are in the description for anyone curious. The next mistake I see many people do is sharpness and noise reduction overkill. Nowadays, drones have insane sharpening skills and noise reduction as well. So they sharpen your footage internally, and by default, it's super digitalized and sharp, not in a good way. So what you need to do, in my opinion, to kind of save that is to drop your sharpness from the settings to -2 and your noise reduction to -1. And then be super specific about each different piece of clip that you have recorded, so your sharpness gets back to its original look, but not in a bad way, not in a very digitalized way. So what I end up doing myself is I use that -2 sharpness on my DJI drones, and then I bring it back as the last note in my DaVinci Resolve Power Grade. And this is the last note that I do. It's add a little bit of sharpening to the footage, just a tiny bit, so it gets that clarity and sharpness back, but not in a bad way, so it doesn't look too digitalized and too fake. In terms of noise reduction, if you're using DaVinci Resolve, it has some pretty amazing noise reduction capabilities, so I would advise you to use that instead of the built-in noise reduction from DJI drones, for example, which is super soft looking and kind of fake, creates those waxy looking shots that, you know, are not very realistic, and it will be a lot better for you to customize and tweak depending on the actual use case. And the last mistake is just blindly copying other people's settings just because they look cool. It doesn't matter how expensive your drone is, if you just copy, you lose your style. And Super Great helps me here too, because it gives me a consistent baseline so I can make my creative decisions that reflect my own vision instead of someone else's. So without having to copy anyone else's settings, here's what you should do. Start perceiving settings as just tools, not rules. So for example, shutter speed depends on your movement and your vision, not on the 180-degree rule. Flat color profile, it depends on lighting and your intentions, not just ideology. Sharpness and noise reduction are about balance, not extremes. And color grading and using LUTs should assist your intents, not replace them. So to finish this off, I think most bad drone footage is not bad because of the pilot. It's because they started with a lot more technical friction that could have been avoided. So start with a clean baseline and think about your movement and the light, and the rest will follow. If you want to see my exact workflow that I use for every single video of mine, I'm going to link it down in the description. Again, it's not a magic fix, but it's a great way to start clean and focus on your creativity. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hit the subscribe button if you want to follow along my insights and my workflow as I share videos like this week after week. This is Mike from Drone Supremacy. Take care, and I'll catch you in the next one. Ciao.